In the last lecture, we looked at the raising of Lazarus by the little-known Marco Pino, and we saw him do a kind of virtuoso job of painting a complex, powerful image of this miracle. Today, we're going to turn to Peter Paul Rubens, one of the best-known artists of all time, and to his highly original painting of a famous story from Greek and Roman antiquity. But first, we'll spend about a minute or so simply looking at it. It's a kind of chaos. There's a dark sea with huge breaking waves and a deep trough. And at the right, there are waves smashing the shore. The sky seems to split open and let in lurid beams, and there's lightning zigzagging down. And in and on the waves are nude females who look perfectly at ease, swimming, body surfing, just up close you can see that they have coral bracelets and pearls in their hair. And one person in the water, in the exact center of the picture, contrasts in every way. He's male. He's not pink like the girls, but gray and greenish. He's stiffly horizontal, and his eyes are closed. He's not swimming, but he seems to be towed along. And still closer, you can see a thin stream of water dribbling from his mouth. He's drowned. And two of the girls are making themselves useful by towing the body, while others are making lamenting gestures like the two in the middle at the top. Some are looking on, witnessing or admiring or imploring like the two at the left. They're both obviously in their element, literally. They're at ease in the water, leaning back on it or riding on it. Another lies on the wave with her back to us. And the more you look, the more nude girls you discover in the waves. Some of them barely visible, all of them involved in the drama. And that's not all. In the corner, just below the reclining girl, and not easy to see at first, is the head of a huge fish with a rolling eye and gaping mouth. Up in the sky, there's flying spume from the wave tops, inky clouds, lurid light, and there are a couple of creatures with wings flying towards the scene, one of them actually carrying a torch. Well, just pull back for a moment. The two girls hauling on the corpse are looking up to the right. And there, at the very edge of the picture, we see a figure in red, a red robe, the only touch of bright color in the picture, flying or falling headlong towards the rocky shore below, where the waves pile up. And looking up close, we can see her face in profile, looking towards the two girls in the water. The artist, Peter Paul Rubens, was an exceptionally talented and ambitious Flemish painter, still in his early 20s, working in Italy. We're going to return to Rubens in just a little while, but first let me turn to the story and fill in the blanks. What we see is the climactic scene in a narrative that every educated person knew in Rubens's lifetime. The ancient myth of the lovers, Hero and Leander. Rubens depended mainly on the version of the story told by Musaeus Grammaticus, who was a Greek writer of the 6th century AD, who's not exactly a household name. There's a much briefer but more famous version by Ovid, but in Rubens's era, the version by Musaeus was thought to be more authoritative, therefore earlier than Ovid's. Musaeus tells a story of reckless summer romance gone terribly wrong. The scene is set in ancient Greek colonies on the Hellespont, way up here, the Dardanelles in modern-day Turkey, on the right in the map. Here, the Hellespont. Hero, or in Greek, Hero, was a young priestess of Aphrodite who lived in the Greek city of Sestos. You can see it there on the map. On Sestos, on the western side of the Hellespont, or on the peninsula of Gallipoli. Her parents were so strict that they confined her to a tower. And across the strait, about a mile away, was Abydos, where the handsome Leander lived. Musaeus says about them, of their two cities, each was the fairest star. At a festival in Sestos one day, the two encountered each other, and it was love at first sight. At first, she resisted Leander's tugging at her gown, saying, "Stranger, what madness is this? Why, wretch, do you drag me, a maiden? Shun the wrath of my parents, rich in many possessions. It is unfit for you to touch the priestess of the goddess, and beyond contrivance that you should come to the bed of a virgin." Leander makes the point that since she's supposed to be serving the goddess of love, she ought to get some experience herself. It's not fitting, he says, that a virgin should attend on Aphrodite. After a lot of pleading by Leander and blushing by Hero, he promises that if she'll light a lantern in her tower, he'll swim across to her every night. She melts. "Stranger," she says, "with your words, you might rouse even a stone." They exchange pledges, and soon Leander is commuting from Abydos every night, swimming across the Hellespont to Sestos, guided by her lamp, and back again before dawn all summer long. As for the priestess of Aphrodite, Musaeus says that she was maiden by day, by night a wife. Even the storms of early winter didn't deter Leander, until one night he was, as Musaeus says, borne on the back of the fiercely shrieking sea. Wave wallowed on wave, and the water was all turmoiled. Sea mingled with upper air, and the din was unrelenting of the loud thundering sea. Leander prayed to Aphrodite and to Poseidon, but no one helped him, says Musaeus, and love could not fend off the fates. Leander's strength finally gave out, and he swallowed a worthless draught of the irresistible brine. Then lo, a bitter gust blew out the faithless lamp, and with it the life and love of hard-suffering Leander. His sleepless lover Hero kept watch, but by dawn he hadn't arrived. Musaeus ends the story with these lines: "When at the foot of the tower she saw her husband, a dead body flayed by the tide rocks, tearing away her embroidered robe from around her breasts and sweeping headlong down, she fell from the lofty tower. And Hero laid in death beside her dead husband, and they had the joy of each other, even in their last perishing." Ovid tells the story much more briefly in his book, the Heroides, which is an imaginary exchange of letters between lovers, in this case Leander and Hero. Rubens would have read the Heroides, of course, but it didn't supply him with anything he could use. All he really needed was Musaeus and a tremendous leap of imagination. And that was to visualize a violent storm at sea and invent all those sea creatures attending to the corpse of Leander. They're daughters of Poseidon, called nereids. They supply action and a whole spectrum of emotional reaction to the drowning. They function in a way like the chorus of a Greek tragedy, amplifying and commenting on what's going on, but without words. Nobody had ever thought to use this device for the story, and nobody had ever shown the deaths of both lovers. Christopher Marlowe, Shakespeare's contemporary, retold the story in a long poem of 1598 that went through many editions. And a few years later, Shakespeare himself, in As You Like It, was so sure that everybody knew the story that he had Rosalind, his brilliant anti-romantic, make fun of it. You're seeing a Victorian painting of the scene, and the great, on the right, the great Lily Langtry in the role. Rosalind says, "They say Leander died for love of Hero, but actually he just came down to the beach to wash, and he got a cramp and drowned." "These stories are all lies," says Rosalind. "Men have died from time to time, and worms have eaten them, but not for love." Hero and Leander figure all through 17th and 18th centuries in the literature, but very seldom in painting. There is this loose and sort of mild adaptation of Rubens' picture by the Venetian painter Domenico Fetti, who admired Rubens and must have seen the Yale picture in Mantua. The storm is over now. The troupe have seen of nereids, you can see, has been reduced to 3, and the gods who helped cause all the trouble are present. Cupid, who inflamed the couple, is weeping, and Poseidon, who riled up the sea, is leaving the scene on the left. On the right, Hero leaps from the tower. In the next generation, a few artists treat the story as a kind of pagan version of the Lamentation of Christ, and they don't allude to Hero's suicide, although Cupid in this picture is there to take the blame for the death of Leander. This is another Flemish painter, Jan van der Hoeke. Lord Byron was so taken with Leander's heroic swims that at the age of 22, during his grand tour, he traveled down from Constantinople to the ruins of Troy and further on down the coast to Abydos, where on the 3rd of May, 1810, he plunged into the Hellespont. And being a very good swimmer and no minor sexual athlete himself, he made it across. By the way, we may have forgotten about Lord Byron's swim, but the Turks haven't. It's kept alive every summer by a race across the Dardanelles for hardcore open water swimmers promoted by local Turkish sponsors. Byron's contemporary William Etty, like other English painters, chose more intimate scenes from the legend, focused on the couple parting after their nights of bliss, or on Hero grieving over Leander's death. An interest in these subjects like this, of course, disappears in the 20th century, with one exception that I like, the highly educated, classically minded American painter Cy Twombly, who often found titles for his paintings in mythology, sometimes actual inspiration too. Here he comes quite close to actually depicting something like the terrible storm. There's a blue sea, there's blue sky, there's a shore on the left in reds and purples like clotted blood, with a surface that seems to drip with rain or maybe tears. I want to turn from the subject of the picture to a brief sketch of Rubens's career, especially his beginnings, since this was one of a dozen or so works that launched him. He wasn't yet 30. He was living in Mantua, far from his home in Antwerp, and he was already sought after by Italian patrons. Rubens had been brought up in a patrician family that had connections to many prominent people in the southern Netherlands. He was given a classical education, typical of his time, starting at the age of 10, centering on the literature of ancient Greece and Rome. As a teenager, he was appointed a page at a court of an elderly countess, where he learned the folkways and etiquette of life at court. which would be useful to him soon enough. He was sent to learn drawing and painting to the studios of 3 Antwerp artists in succession before he became a master in his own right at the age of 21. From them, Rubens absorbed 2 different artistic traditions that he in turn embodied all his life. One was the heritage of Peter Bruegel the Elder, which he absorbed from his first master, Tobias Verhaeghe. Landscape played an essential role. Usually as the setting for stories enacted by small figures and stories with moral lessons, some from classical sources, others illustrating proverbs being a body of German and French and Flemish folk wisdom, a kind of parallel world to the classical tales of Seneca and Ovid and Virgil. This is the fall of Icarus, the ambitious young man who trusted the wax wings that his father made for him and flew too close to the sun. Bruegel had set the example for this in his only mythological composition, where the proud, imprudent Icarus falls, just as Ovid says, but into a world where the plowman keeps working and doesn't even notice, an ironic sort of visualization of a Flemish proverb. Rubens's other 2 masters were Adam van Noort and Otto van Veen. Van Veen, the leading Antwerp artist, court painter to the archdukes who governed the Spanish Netherlands, a man who had a big workshop and evidently a good library of books and prints where Rubens could build up his knowledge of the literature and see pictures by the greatest masters of the Renaissance in Italy. Not the originals, mostly, but black and white printed reproductions. Van Veen had been in Rome. He'd worked for the Rudolf II in Prague and had an up-to-date idea of artistic goings-on in Europe. He gave Rubens a grounding in composition and pose and gesture, and also showed him how a large studio was organized to produce work of all kinds. History paintings, including religious subjects, portraits, in fact, anything a client needed. By 1598 or so, Rubens had used an engraving after Raphael, there on the left, maybe belonging to Van Veen, as the basis for a large painting of Adam and Eve on the right that's more skillfully painted even than his own master's work. And he made one of the most beautiful small portraits painted by anybody since Van Eyck or Memling, this little image on copper of an artisan or an architect in the Metropolitan Museum. More impressive still, I think, Rubens had taken on complex paintings with crowds of figures and a lot of dramatic action, about the same size as the hero in Leander at Yale, and they show how far he'd gotten even before he arrived in Italy. The Battle of the Amazons and the Greeks on the left shows a struggle between fierce Thracian women who have no use for men except for mating and who dispose of male babies and enjoy battle with the Greek men that they're chronically at war with. The picture is a tangle of riders, foot soldiers, and dead bodies, where the painter's virtuosity with individual figures, poses, groups is on show. Any real connoisseur in Antwerp could spot the prototypes for some of the figures. The dead Greek sprawling on the ground, for example, is based on a print after Michelangelo. And the Hercules-like bodybuilder here on the right, struggling with 2 Amazons, is a quote from another work Rubens had never seen, the Laocoon, the great Hellenistic group in the Vatican representing the seriously afflicted Greek priest and his sons, which Rubens knew from one or another of the engravings, like this one that spread the fame of that statue far and wide. Part of Rubens's purpose in going to Italy was to study these things firsthand, to draw them, as he did here, understand their anatomy and expression, absorb them completely, which he was doing here as he visited the Vatican and made the drawing at the bottom. And it was also to learn how to tell a story more cogently. That would mean editing. and tightening his compositions, clarifying them, getting his subordinate figures and his chorus, that is, his chorus, to express themselves with body language that could be understood. Only 6 years or so separate these two pictures. Most of them Rubens spent in Italy. For Netherlandish artists, the road to Italy had already been well traveled. In 1609, Karel van Mander, the influential Dutch writer and painter, described Rome as the capital of Pictura's school and called a trip to Italy a prerequisite for the completion of an artist's training. Rubens was not going there as a beginner. He'd already become a master in the Antwerp Guild, and he had a student of his own who came along with him. He wasn't just going for study either. He had connections with people in high places, which would be essential if he was going to get work. And if he succeeded, he might just stay there, like a lot of other Flemish artists had done. Quite likely, it was his teacher Van Veen who sent him across the Alps to the Duke of Mantua, to Vincenzo Gonzaga. The Duke gave him a home base in Italy for nearly 8 years, which allowed him to travel for long periods to Venice, Rome, Florence, Genoa, and Spain. The court and the palace at Mantua must have staggered Rubens. You see the ducal palace at the left the way it appeared a century earlier. Inside the palace were rooms decorated by Mantegna 130 years earlier, including the famous painted room with scenes from the life of the court, where ambassadors and kings were brought to be impressed. There was also a ceiling that performed a trick of perspective that opened the ceiling to the sky above. In Venice, where Rubens also went, there were pictures in churches and palaces, including the Palace of the Doge, many of them enormous. Rubens built his career as a history painter very largely on what he saw in Venice, and he became more than anything else a Venetian painter. He studied Titian's altarpieces in the Church of the Frari, especially the Assumption of the Virgin on the high altar there, which was a painting that stayed with him all his life, not just the composition and the rich color, but also its crowd of energetic, believable apostles below and the angels above. Here on the right is a sketch in oil by Rubens at Yale, painted more than 30 years after he saw Titian. It's pale, of course, because it's a sketch and it's meant to suggest color. And the details are all different, but its overall design is still a kind of variation on a theme of Titian. And probably more important for Rubens than Titian was the paintings of Veronese and Tintoretto, which were all over the city. This is an allegory on the left by Veronese of the theological virtues and St. Mark, a subject that might easily be boringly schematic. But Veronese introduces some physical excitement and glamour. Veronese painted ancient history too. On the right, a rare subject, Alexander, after defeating an enemy, being gracious and humble before the enemy's family, an example of generosity by the powerful. Veronese knew Roman literary sources and also had a tremendous sense of stagecraft and sumptuous costuming, all of which Rubens drew on later on. Tintoretto's paintings were even more forceful in composition and lighting and body language. This is his painting of St. Mark freeing a Christian slave who's being tortured, St. Mark here. And you've probably already seen why I say body language. Rubens remembered this startling upside-down pose of St. Mark flying down into the scene and adapted it for Hérault plunging toward the rocks. You can see what struck Rubens about Tintoretto's Last Supper. It has a solid geometrical structure, but light flickers off the edges of things, off the humans and angels, and makes them less material. Light supplies the energy, and it signals divine presence. Rubens's painting of a dozen or so years later couldn't be more different in subject, but it uses light in a similar kind of spectral way to give excitement and a kind of numinous quality to the scene. The light becomes an actor in the scene, and I think this comes from Tintoretto. The idea that light and even weather can play an active role in a picture, be part of the subject and a sense of the painting, is an invention of Venetian painters. And Rubens could see the beginnings of this in the atmospheric paintings by Giorgione and the young Titian, like the celebrated Tempest, where there is an ominous sky and a flash of lightning, shifting light, and air charged with electricity. This begins a development in which Rubens's great storm in Hero and Leander plays a part. Rubens broadened his education in Rome with the help of his brother Philip, who was a classical scholar who lived there, well-connected, and an excellent guide to the sculpture and other Roman antiquities on the Capitoline Hill, in the Vatican, and in many private palaces and villas. This is Rubens' study of the marble torso in the Vatican, still there, a Hellenistic piece that was revered by artists in the Renaissance, by Michelangelo in particular, for the way it gets across complex movement and potential energy. Rubens made this portrait, of which you just saw a detail, this portrait a few years later. It shows Rubens at the left, you saw him before, just behind his brother Philip. At the right is another Flemish amateur scholar, Jan van der Wouwer, and the man in the leopard stole here is a posthumous portrait of the professor who had just been the teacher of Wouwer and of Philip Rubens at Louvain University, Justus Lipsius. The group portrait says something about how serious these Netherlanders were in their work of discovering and explaining the lessons of Greece and Rome. Rubens threw himself into a study of classical antiquities and learned enough to produce the illustrations for this book by his brother. There was also modern and contemporary art to be seen in churches and palaces. Rubens seems to have been open to anything, and he was in sync with the current progressive attitude towards picture making in Italy. Italians were no longer so entranced with exaggerated anatomies and difficult poses, the maniera that we saw Marco Pino practicing in the last lecture, or with complex compositions and perverse color combinations. Painters were moving towards more natural-looking figures and more classicizing arrangements. And the main exponents were Rubens's older contemporaries from Bologna, led by Annibale Carracci. When Rubens arrived in Rome, Annibale's masterpiece here was just finished, the great Galleria in the Farnese Palace with the Loves of the Gods. And here Rubens found a lot that he could use, as he had with Veronese. He found classical learning treated with wit and ease in the storytelling, and figures of believable proportions with warm, rich color, the kind of hybrid of Roman strength and clarity with Venetian brilliance. He also encountered paintings by Caravaggio, which were, at the time, a hot topic in Rome, but he didn't immediately pick up Caravaggio's innovations. He must have been struck by how Caravaggio reduced the cast of actors, no spectators, no chorus, and how he gave them a kind of touching plainness and humanity, and how he lit the scenes with sharply focused light. This Martyrdom of St. Peter was part of a commission for the Cerasi Chapel in Santa Maria del Popolo, which got 3 great paintings just a year or 2 before Rubens arrived. One by Annibale Carracci in the center, and 2 scenes by by Caravaggio from the lives of Saints Peter and Paul on the sides. And these must have made a deep impression on him as an ensemble, as well as individually. For years, Rubens had known the frescoes that Raphael painted in the papal apartments in the Vatican Palace, but only in engravings. Seeing them, seeing their color and their scale, taught him how eloquent the layout of a scene could be. Symmetry, for example, could make make moral and intellectual order seem inevitable. Architectural space could make the action resonate. Figures could be clearly outlined and shaded so that the artifice in making them seemed to disappear. In the Sistine Chapel, Michelangelo's paintings must have startled Rubens in something like the way they do now, now that they've lost their soot and grime and have regained something of the brilliance, much of the brilliance they had and had lost over the centuries. With Michelangelo, the lessons were about the tremendous power of this race of nude humans, our ancestors. For him, the setting, that is the space, the architecture, doesn't count for much. What counts is the gravity of these people, their mental and spiritual energy, their potential for sin. Here, these are people who are fleeing from God's punishment, the flood in Genesis, and their potential for intellectual accomplishment and for virtue. Here, the prophet Daniel. There were individual figures that Rubens could use, and they show up in his work soon after his time in Rome. For instance, Leda and the Swan was a painting by Michelangelo that has since been destroyed, but survived in many painted and engraved copies, one of which Rubens himself copied several times. The subject was one of the kinkier episodes in The Loves of the Gods, when Leda, the queen of Sparta, lay with her husband on the same night that she was seduced by the shape-shifting Zeus, who appeared in the guise of a swan. Rubens took Michelangelo's muscular but blissfully languorous Leda and made her more conventionally female. Not long after, Rubens makes a drawing that transforms her, minus her swan, into a nereid. And then, sure enough, she appears in a painting and lives on in New Haven, Connecticut. Rubens must have seen this drawing on the left by Michelangelo, showing the fall of Phaeton with its upside-down horses, driver spilling out as his chariot gets too close to the sun. Rubens took up the challenge and painted an even more audacious version of the subject right around the time he painted Hero and Leander. And I'll come back to this picture in a little while. Well, Rubens could have stayed in Italy and had a successful career there, but after almost 8 years away, he went home to Antwerp to see his dying mother and decided to stay. This was good timing. Antwerp soon revived from a long recession caused by the war with rebel Dutch provinces and a blockade. The truce was declared, trade was restored, merchants were readier than before to commission paintings and sculpture for the churches of the town and for their own houses. Rubens was appointed a court painter in Antwerp to the Habsburg Archduke and Archduchess, Albert and Isabella, and he moved in the highest circle of wealthy, cultivated people, most of them educated in classics and practicing Catholics. A prominent member was Rubens's contemporary and patron Cornelis van der Geest, the owner of this staggering art collection. There is the host pointing out a picture to Albert and Isabella on the left, and there too is the Prince of Poland, and between them here is Rubens with the ear of the Archduke. And the painting on the wall directly behind them, getting the best light, is a picture by Rubens. This collector also bought ancient sculpture. You can see quite a lot of them on the right, a whole lineup of Roman marbles. But there was a rival buyer in Antwerp, and that was Rubens himself. And he also had the space for them. Soon after he got back from Italy, needing room for his art collection and his family, you see him with his first wife, Isabella Brandt on the left, he bought and remodeled a large house and garden to resemble a Renaissance palazzo, which was surely the grandest residence ever owned by an artist. Now, in case you're wondering what became of the pictures that Rubens had painted in Italy, like Hero and Leander, most of them stayed in Italy, including this one. We know that because it's almost certainly the painting called Dead Leander in the Arms of Nereids, mentioned by the Italian poet Giambattista Marino in a letter in 1613. 14 years later, the Duke of Buckingham bought the picture, the favorite of Charles I of England, and then in 1637 it was bought by another ambitious painter, none other than Rembrandt, who kept the picture for 7 years in his own great house on the Jodenbraestraat in Amsterdam, where he lived in splendid style, very consciously rivaling that of Rubens. Then he sold the picture for a solid profit of around 100 guilders, because Rembrandt had a sideline, profitable one. He was an art dealer. The picture stayed in Holland for about 40 years, long enough to inspire 3 well-known Dutchmen to write poems about it. Rubens' studio was full of people. Like Rembrandt, he had pupils, and unlike Rembrandt, or at least we think, he had a team of assistants who were there to participate in an elaborate system of production. This was based on his experience in Otto von Veen's workshop, which is something like what you see here on the right, but more ambitious, because in Rome he'd learned about how the Raphael studio operated, the great model of division of labor, and other studios that he could observe firsthand. Alongside the production of paintings, Rubens had printmakers working from his designs in engraving and woodcut. On the left, you see engraving proceeding through the various stages of production. Like Raphael, Rubens never engraved a plate or cut a woodblock himself, but the amazing quality of these prints must have depended on quite a thorough supervision, not just clarity of his own designs. I can't survey the rest of Rubens' spectacular career, but in a few minutes I'm going to touch on some of his later history paintings and what they reveal. Right now, we're going back to Hero and Leander. Earlier I said that illustrations of the story were rare before Rubens' time, and his way of staging the drama didn't have any precedent that I knew of. So I wanted to ask, where did his pictorial ideas come from? Why did he choose the subject? And what was his purpose in treating it this way? About pictorial ideas, I don't know of a single earlier painting of Hero and Leander, but there were images in other media. His brother, the antiquarian, may well have known Roman coins minted in Abydos, like this one, showing on one side the emperor, at the time Commodus, and at the other side the local heroes, that is, Leander swimming, with a fish shown just below him, and Hero on top of her tower holding the lamp. No storm yet. It's a very economical storytelling. At the left, there's a pile of armor, helmet, sword, and cloak that obviously belonged to Leander. And overhead is a winged child with a torch, a conventional way to show Eros, Cupid, the troublemaker. Rubens takes that last idea and gives it a learned twist. Eros is flying down, but he's got an inverted torch. That gives him a particular aspect. He's the bringer of death, Eros Thanatos. This ambiguous character turns up in many Greek and Roman examples, like this terracotta figure on the right. Love that brings death is the heart of the Leander and Hero story. Eros Thanatos appearing in the sky is a signal that the gods are present. It gives a higher significance to the action, much as an angel in a Christian scene would do, flying down with the palm of martyrdom. Now, there were some Renaissance pictures of the story, but not much from Ovid for Rubens to learn from. The illustrated versions of Ovid and Musaeus in the upper right were cartoonish. The Dutch painter Maarten van Heemskerk had been in Rome, had studied the monuments, so he was equipped to fake the architecture of cities like Abydos that he'd never seen. And here he puts in the foreground Leander's act of stripping and leaping into the sea. He's also swimming in the middle ground, but there's not a single thing for Rubens here. Rubens chose to paint the end of the story, the storm, the final swim, the deaths of the lovers. And nobody had done that before. To picture it, I think that Rubens looked to paintings of sea storms and shipwrecks that follow his fellow Flemish artists had begun to paint around this time, like this one, for example, by Paul Brill, painted for no less a patron than the Pope, on the vault over the holy stairs in the Vatican Palace. It has a wildly stylized stormy sky and water, and, because it represents Jonah and the whale, a very big fish, like Rubens's. More recent, I think more useful for Rubens, would have been this painting by Frederik van Valkenburg, another shipwreck, but one with some suggestive things: the inky sky, the beams of yellow sunlight, the crackling bolts of lightning, and a wild sea. The models were actually very few. A few drawings show us how Rubens prepared to paint the picture. There's a very loosely drawn composition in pen, probably not very easily seen in this slide, but anyway, a pen that shows Leander's corpse stretched out in the trough of the wave. There are nereids, mostly riding on the wave tops. Only a few of them actually react to the sight of the dead man. Another sketchy drawing here on the upper left shows more nereids, but they're hard to decipher and don't add much. Rubens would normally have made studies of the figures, but we only have the one that you saw before, which was based, and that's here on the lower right, based on the Leda of Michelangelo, rather than probably on a live model. For the painting, Rubens rearranged the composition, and he gave most of the nereids active roles in lamenting. The idea of including Hero's leap from the tower isn't there yet. But in any event, the essentials are there: the wild, twisting waves, the pliant nudes, contrasting with the stiffness of the dead swimmer, all in this rapid drawing. Now I return to the subject and what it might have signified. For many people, Rubens is colored with the adjective Rubensian, summoning up flesh, gorgeous, saftig, lusciously painted nudes. We're likely to see Rubens himself as worldly, which he was, and maybe amoral, or at least self-indulgent, which actually he wasn't. We might think that for Rubens and for his audience, almost all Catholics, antique gods and heroes lived in a world of sexual license, a world of escapist fantasy. For instance, when he shows Venus and Adonis parting in the morning, Venus clinging to him, perhaps we imagine that we're supposed to envy their easy hookup. Of course, there was the pleasure of looking at the picture and looking at Venus, who certainly had some titillation to offer the clients of the painter. But Rubens also saw painting as a way to exemplify how people should and shouldn't behave. For him, and for the educated audience he painted for, the point was that Adonis was leaving Venus to go hunting, and very soon he was going to get himself gored to death. Venus, being a sensible female, tries to hold him back. Adonis, being a headstrong male, assumes he's going to overcome the dangers that are part of the natural order of things. Rubens was a believer in moderation. Adonis was being immoderate. Adonis believed he could have it all, and he paid. Rubens meant this portrait of himself and his friends as a tribute to Lipsius and his teaching. The part of that teaching that penetrated deepest into Rubens's life was not about classical myths or about Roman sculpture. It was Stoicism, a way of thinking and behaving that's embedded in Rubens's work, along with Catholicism. The two systems of belief, Stoic and Christian, weren't just compatible, they were complementary. In fact, Stoic ethical beliefs had been absorbed into Christian thinking. St. Paul wrote about the Stoic philosopher Aratus in a letter to the Athenians, saying that Aratus was one in whom we live and move and have our being. As I said earlier, the bust portrait here in the background was believed to represent Seneca, the most influential Roman Stoic philosopher, alongside Cicero. Lipsius, here, the scholar, teacher, Lipsius had edited and published Seneca's writings, and Rubens actually owned the bust in the picture here that you, and made this drawing of it. So what were Rubens's Stoic beliefs, and how could they help us understand his art, especially the history paintings, Hero and Leander in particular? Stoics from the beginning of the 3rd century BC deduced that the world is orderly, that nature embodies a design that humans should conform to. They saw the world as a unity of interdependent parts, like a large city. Humans have a duty to be loyal to that great unity, said Cicero and Seneca, and to be active in public affairs. Leaving those affairs to specialists was dangerous. Ancient Romans lived in a practical, hard-headed culture, and they didn't have much time for abstruse speculation. Stoicism was a kind of wisdom they could actually put to use. If the natural design of the world is a complex unity, then individuals and the state have an ethical obligation to respect that unity. So, people who live according to nature will be considerate of each other. They will be orderly and restrained in their behavior. They will honor their family obligations. They'll obey their parents. They'll be moderate and avoid every kind of excess. They will cultivate peace, and they'll see war as something unnatural, a grave human failure. Rubens believed that the ancients made art of the highest order and that he needed to absorb it fully. He said so. What he didn't say was that the ancients had ethical ideals that are still valid, and those too required study. But he didn't need to say it. Like every educated person, he had learned those ideals in school from Latin texts. He also knew that Stoic ideas were embedded, as I said, in Catholic doctrine, but with some substitutions. The Christian God took the place of nature as a dictator of moral law. The Christian goal was not fulfillment in the here and now or the creation of a wise, happy society as it was with the Stoics. Instead, the goal was individual salvation from eternal damnation, which could be gained through faith in Christ and obedience to the laws of the church. Now, these are big substitutions, but in actual practice, Christian behavior was based on Stoic foundations. Lipsius, the teacher, wasn't just a classicist, he was a Catholic convert. And he also wrote treatises on miraculous images of the Blessed Virgin Mary in several Flemish pilgrimage sites. So, how did Stoic thought affect Rubens? I mean, it certainly shaped his personality and the way he lived. He devoted a lot of time to public service, to diplomacy, to putting an end to war. I think it also affected his choice of subjects and the way he treats them. Hero and Leander is a good example, and so is the Fall of Phaeton, which may have been painted as a companion piece. The Hero and Leander story is about ill-fated love. I think it appealed to Rubens because it not only let him paint a spectacular scene, but also because these lovers brought on their own deaths. Hero had taken a vow to serve the goddess Aphrodite, but she broke it. She fell for Leander's selfish argument that if she's going to serve the goddess of love, she ought to have some experience. She was faithless. On top of that, she didn't have her parents' permission to marry. Her behavior was unfilial, which is a worse offense in antiquity than it is now. By seducing her, Leander behaved impiously. And by swimming in a storm, he behaved recklessly, pridefully, exhibiting what the Greeks called hubris. Both lovers were slaves to their passion. If they had exercised the Stoic virtues of restraint and respect for natural law, they would have mastered their passion. They did not, and they were punished by nature itself, by the great storm, witnessed by the gods' representatives, the Nereids of Poseidon, and in the sky, the winged helpers of Aphrodite in the guise of death. Every mistake the lovers made violated what Stoics called right conduct. The picture is intended as more than a painterly drama, more than a beautiful painting, more than an antiquarian exercise. It was meant as a lesson in conduct. And I think the same is true of Phaeton's downfall. He was the son of Phoebus Apollo, the sun god, who drove his chariot across the sky through all the hours of day, keeping the sun in place and maintaining the world for humans. His brash son, Phaeton, claims he could do the same thing and finally persuades his father to give him a try. The horses bolt, Phaeton gets too close to the sun, and not only does he perish, but the forests of Africa burn, making it a desert forever after. Apollo is partly to blame, of course, being an unwise father, but the story is really about Phaeton and the headstrong braggart that he was. Like Leander, Phaeton was immoderate. He exhibited hubris, and for that he is literally brought down. Just a couple more examples of Stoic thinking behind Rubens's work. Here's one from the Old Testament. Samson was the great hope of the Israelites while they were in bondage to the rival tribe of Philistines. God gave him superhuman strength in exchange for a vow that he would never cut his hair or beard. Otherwise, he would lose the strength. And after many feats of strength, his weakness proves to be that Philistine undercover agent, Delilah. He lets himself be seduced, and after she presses him, he reveals his vow. He's been taken prisoner, and he dies a dramatic death. The moral is well known. A man sworn to serve God and his people yields to passion and betrays both. Here's another strong man, disarmed. We've already met him in the great painting at Yale by Pollaiuolo, where he's leaner and meaner and about to shoot the centaur with his poisoned arrow. He and his audience knew very well what the consequences of that would be. Hercules would die horribly from the same poison. In Rubens's picture, Hercules gets off easier. Hercules has had much too much to drink. His muscles are so much dead weight, he's become too weak to walk without help. And his lack of self-control costs him his one great gift of strength, and he shames himself. He becomes a figure of fun. And I think even in Christian subjects we can see Stoic virtues. Rubens painted his first great Antwerp altarpiece for his friends and patron and intellectual peer, Cornelis van der Geest, a man we saw in his collection earlier. This is a startling conception of the crucifixion, one rarely seen before. The cross is actually being hoisted up by a crew of executioners who are straining every muscle. And in the midst of this, Christ is not shown with an agonized expression, as he usually was, but he's looking up to heaven with an expression that looks like resignation. It seems to signal his calm acceptance of his coming death. He exhibits Stoic virtue as well as Christian confidence. Of all Rubens's images of war and peace, the most heartfelt is this one, which he painted for the Grand Duke of Tuscany. Again, it speaks the language of classical allegory, and again, he brings those abstractions to life with tremendous physical action and brushwork that's full of nervous energy. The distraught woman on the left in black represents Europe, who's in despair. Mars, the god of war, in the center of the picture, is running amok with his bloody sword. Venus, again, the goddess of love, tries to hold him back, but she can't, even with the help of little cupids. The wild figure of fury is stronger, pulling him toward the stormy side of the picture, storm clouds that first appeared in Hero and Leander. The victims of war are not soldiers, but civilians. The family, the cowering mother and child at the far right, the fruits of civilized lives, literature, music, architecture, their attributes on the ground, all being trampled. War is the evil that Rubens, in his role as a diplomat, worked patiently to prevent for most of his life, beginning with the mission to Spain in 1603, when he was living in Mantua, and ending during his time in England, when in 1630 he worked to conclude peace between England and Spain. Love and war are Rubens's great themes. To picture them, Rubens turns again and again to ancient poetry and turns literature into art. He constructs a single image for the finale of this story. He depends on an audience that knows that story, as they originally did, from having read one of the Latin versions. The delight for the original audience was to see how Rubens visualized that climax. Ovid and Musaeus only gave him the basics: the swim, the storm, the drowning, the leap from the tower. Rubens invented this entire staging. In the center, this elemental contrast between life and death, the warm, pink, pliant Nereids and the cold, stiff, bluish corpse of Leander. And right on the central axis of the composition, Leander's now useless maleness. The wild waves have a nervous, almost crazed graphic energy supplied by Rubens's restless brushstrokes. He makes the waves gather up and burst on the shore in one final crash, like the hopes of the two lovers. This powerful design and painterly dash were not just intended to be a pleasure to see. They tell the story, they convey its moral, a moral about a broken vow and about hubris. Today we may not be particularly moved by the tragedy of these lovers or by the image of nature boiling up to punish them. But I want to end by accepting Rubens's invitation to think a few Stoic thoughts about offenses against nature. I mean thoughts about our own excesses as a society, about the interdependence of us all, about our failure to live moderately in harmony with the natural world. Looks now as though those failings will have a high price. That great punishing storm here might well prompt us to consider whether we're prepared to pay that price. Next week, we leap into the 18th century with a stirring picture of a Roman heroine and the revolution that her sacrifice brought about. Please don't miss that if you can help it. Thank you.